Thanks, Jeff. And a very good morning to you all, my brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ. As you may remember, the last couple of exhorts I've done, I've been focusing very much on the parables that are sometimes not very obvious to us. And so I thought I'd try and look at the daily readings today. But in one sense, I'm spoiled because it's absolutely full of them. And the other sense, not so much, because I would suggest most of these are actually very well known to us. And I don't know how much new ground I could discover in these parables. Nevertheless, what I'd like to do this morning is just to touch on one or two of these aspects as we go through the record. And we could talk about any number of them, but just very briefly, the parable of the pounds is, of course, not a story that's hidden in any shape or form. It is a parable, quite clearly so. And so I won't spend any time on that really, except to say that the moral of the story of the pounds is that each one of us has in equal measure been given the beauty of the truth. And then it's up to us to decide how we make the best use of that in our lifetime and bring forth fruit for it. So that one is, I think, very clear to us. Then we have what I've called the Parable of Zacchaeus. Now, it might not be immediately obvious that this is a parable, but again, not very cryptic. And the things that I'm going to speak about when I speak about this, and even the subsequent stories, I think are reasonably well documented in the Brotherhood. So you may have heard this. Nevertheless, I hope it's of some benefit to us. So what do we make of Zacchaeus? Well, Zacchaeus is described as a sinner. But it's not a sinner in the terms that we would have described somebody as sinner, as in somebody who just sins. This is a sinner, as the Jews would have somebody described as a sinner, who was a person completely beyond redemption, a no-hoper. These terms were reserved for those who were perhaps harlots and tax collectors, the completely despised people. And of course, Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector, he was chief among the tax collectors. So why did they despise him so much? Well, they were considered among the Jews as traitors, because of course they were Jewish people, but they had to collect tax for the Roman government. And I don't think any Jew would particularly like his money taken from him, but certainly not from one of his fellow members, who in turn would become rich as a result. So these people were greatly despised. So Zacchaeus would stick out like a sore thumb, both in terms of his profession, but in terms of his stature, of course, as well, which would be very hard to hide from. And everybody would know that he's coming, and everybody would hate and despise this man. But to his credit, we have in this story his response, and it's a real absolute turnaround. And it's based on his determination to see Jesus against all odds. And there were a lot of odds stacked against him. First of all, you have to remember that being a rich man is going to be an obstacle for him, because he knows that if he's going to get near Jesus, even if he didn't know too much about this man, he would know that this is going to likely be the end of his riches, which is a very difficult thing for anybody to bear. Beyond that, of course, he had the difficulties of his position, that he wasn't in a position where he could go and speak to people and ask about this man. People wouldn't give him the time of day. And then he had a stature which his physical limitation prevented him from maybe seeing over the top or pushing his way through a crowd or anything like that. So he had all these different limitations set before him, but whatever the case, he was determined enough to get past that. So where is the parable? Well, the parable is often very evident when you see a quirky or unusual detail that makes you think about something. And of course, the quirkiness of this story is that there's a dignified man sitting in a tree, which is a very unusual thing to expect to see. And you have to picture Jesus walking under that tree and looking up, and what do you typically expect to see in a tree on a good day? Is a piece of fruit. Now, Zacchaeus may have been a very small man, but he makes for an exceptionally large piece of fruit. And Jesus was there on that occasion, looking up and seeing fruit in that tree. And you'll remember just a few days later, But he walks past the fig tree also looking for fruit, and he finds nothing. So the parable is that Jesus would be looking for fruits, and he would find it in the exceptional people that perhaps nobody else would expect to see them in, the people who knew they were sinners, the people who were willing to change and turn their life around. And he would forever be looking for people like that, and he would find them if they were determined to find him. And should he find such a person, what happens? Well, that person goes to abide with Jesus. Jesus will come and abide in that person's house. I think the parable is quite clear there, and a very encouraging message to us all. So the nation as a whole would be cast off very shortly, but there would still be individuals here and there who would be known to God. Now we move on to the grand entry into Jerusalem. And this is where we want to spend the bulk of our time today. And I focus particularly on the donkey itself, on the ass. Now, has it ever occurred to you that it's a strange thing that Jesus would ask for two animals? We don't read that in the Luke record. When we put all the different gospel records together, we find that there were two animals. And unless you are planning on performing tricks, you don't need to ride two animals. There's only a need for one. So straight away, we have a clue that there is something a little unusual here. And when you piece all the records together and put them side by side, you'll actually find that it's not just the donkeys that are paired up. There are numerous things in this record which come in doubles or in pairs. So, for instance, looking at Mark chapter 11, it says, when they came nigh to Jerusalem, unto Bethphage and Bethany. So they're the two towns, the two little cities that they come up to first. And Bethany and Bethphage, as you might know, are the house of figs and the house of dates. These are two cities, or two little towns, I shouldn't really say cities, very small, two little towns representing the Jews and the Gentiles, the figs and the dates. And so we have that. But not only that, we have the fact that he went up to the city at the Mount of Olives, and he sent forth two of his disciples. Not one, not three, exactly two, which is another curious thing. Then Matthew goes on to say that he found there two animals. So in Matthew it says that Jesus instructed these two to go into the village over against you, and straightway you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them unto me. Bring them both. So we'll come back to the donkeys a little later. And when they went their way, they found the colt tied by the door without, in a place where two ways meet, and they loose him. So again, we have this idea of two ways meeting. Now, I'm not sure how you picture that scene yourself, and I have no way of proving it, but I certainly picture a scene where they're walking along maybe a slightly narrower path. They get to the place where two ways met, and ahead of them, if you can picture this, ahead of them is a broader path, and behind them are two narrower paths. And just, I say that because, as far as the parable is concerned, we have this idea that in the course of history behind them, the Jew and the Gentile have lived two distinct and very different paths. But now the moral of this story, and one of the chief reasons why all these details are there for us, is because now we at last have the Jew and the Gentile meeting and bound in the same hope. And then going forward, you're going to have the two united. So anyway, that's the way I see it, and I found it a helpful little mental picture. Then back to Mark. So we have all these ideas of two, but there's one more. In Mark chapter 11, verse 9, it says, as he's proceeding into the city of Jerusalem now, it says, they that went before him and they that followed cried, saying, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. So there very specifically, we have this idea of two multitudes, one that went before and one that went behind. So again, the Jew and the Gentile. And over again in this section, we're having this idea of these two different distinct people and Christ bringing them together. And just to sort of finish off this section and maybe round off the parable at a very high level, bird's eye view, we see in Mark chapter 11, as we carry on reading what happened after that, it says that Jesus entered into Jerusalem and into the temple, and when he had looked around upon all things, and it was now evening, he went into Bethany with the 12. So what happened there? Jesus comes in to inspect the people, inspect the Jews, inspect the temple, and he finds it lacking. And where does he go afterwards? He goes to Bethany, not to Bethphage. He goes to Bethany because that is the house of the Gentiles. And seeing a fig tree afar off having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he got on it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And of course, we know what that means. That is lack of fruitfulness in the Jewish people, and the time was not yet. And so he curses the fig tree, and then finally he goes back and he pronounces judgments on that temple, and he cleanses the temple and he empties it out. So I hope that illustration is quite clear of some of the elements of this parable. But now we're going to circle back and have a closer look at these donkeys. Now, I have to confess to my shame that I had to open Google at this point and make sure I understood about all the different terms for donkeys. And I'm especially ashamed, since I grew up on a farm, that I didn't know some of these things. But just in case, maybe for my kids at least, or there's somebody else maybe who doesn't really know the difference between all these terms, let's just go through some of them. So first of all, the easiest one of all, of course, an ass and a donkey are synonymous. And particularly that they can be both male and female of any age. Okay, so that's a very general term. But a male and a female donkey, although we don't read these terms necessarily in scripture, are a Jack and a Jenny. So I didn't know that. That was my first bit of learning there. But what is a colt exactly? Now, I don't know what a colt necessarily meant in the Bible in terms of, the actual technicality of it. But if you look in today's terms, what a colt is, it's considered to be a male specifically less than 4 years old. So as I say, I don't know if that was applied as the term in Bible times, but certainly it's a young male donkey, probably less than 4. And then comes the mule. Now, I'd be very curious, I won't ask for a show of hands, who actually knows what a mule is? Because I thought it was straightforward, but there's a little bit more to it. It is not a horse plus a donkey. It's a donkey plus a horse. Okay, now what I'm saying there is the male comes first. A male donkey and a female horse is a mule. The other way around is not a mule. The other way around is actually called a hinny, which is quite a much more rare animal to find. So with that little pearl of wisdom behind us, it doesn't help specifically in the story too much, except now what I'd like to do is look at some references in the Bible to things relating to this story. So we want to look at things relating to either donkeys or mules, or things relating to the journey that Christ took on that donkey on that day. So I flipped open the concordance and I found a staggering amount of references. Now, I suppose I shouldn't be amazed at this point, because the donkey is such a central part of their lives as the working animal. The donkey and ox often appear together. That was the one thing I observed immediately, that they're both the working animals. And I decided to just pick 5 or 6 references, not necessarily the most important, but perhaps useful to just frame our thoughts as we think about some of the things that happened on that day. And maybe Jesus himself was thinking about some of these. So the first one that came to mind was Genesis 22, verse 3, and that is the story of Isaac, who was off to be sacrificed. So this is how it reads. Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. And then I got lost in that section for quite some time, because as I'm sure we all know, there are so many references there and allusions to things that followed, and specifically in Luke chapter 19 that we read this morning. I won't go into any of those details, except, of course, just to remind us that on that occasion, there was the Father and the Son, Abraham and Isaac, representing the son that was to be sacrificed. And maybe to just think of the mood that day as they settled that donkey and headed off to the place where the sacrifice would take place, and what they thought would be the inevitable, a very painful moment to endure. So that was on the ass. Then I thought of the incident in 1 Kings chapter 1, and that's where Solomon was proclaimed to be king. So I'll read that section for you from verse 33 of chapter 1. The king also said unto them, so this is David on his deathbed, and he's worried that the wrong king is going to succeed him. So now he is looking for a sign and indication to the people that he has selected Solomon to be the king. So the king said unto them, take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule. Okay, there's not a donkey, and bring him down to Gihon. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there, king over Israel, and blow you the trumpet and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that ye may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead, and I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. So David wasn't one who was known to have horses. His son, of course, was, which was part of his downfall. And it was written into God's law that the kings were not to multiply themselves horses, which is, I presume, why he didn't have any. It was as a result of that command. But they had a mule, and I believe from what I've read that even the mule was not something they would breed within Israel. I'm not sure how true that is, but from what I've read in historical terms, they wouldn't like to interbreed two different animals like that. So the mules that you read of in scripture are most likely imported. They were gifts, they were from the neighboring countries in one form or another, and were, as a result, quite prized possessions because they were somewhat more powerful than a donkey in the normal sense. So in this case, King Solomon was given King David's mule. Now, David and Solomon both represent Christ in a different form. David represents him in his first advent as the sufferer, and Solomon as the one who really succeeded the throne and ruled in that prosperous kingdom. So in this case, we have Solomon entering on the mule, and you can make of that what you wish, but it feels like there's an elevated status slightly above the donkey as he comes and succeeds and takes his throne. So that's how he was marked, though, as the king designate. The stamp was that he was going to be on the king's mule. So that was a very marked point. Then we have the story of Jehu. Now, in this particular story, I don't think Jehu was on a horse or a mule or a donkey, but for some reason he came to mind. I can't picture him in any other way except on the back of a chariot with javelin in his hand, or on a horse. He's a bit of a colorful character in that way. But it does nevertheless have a very interesting detail when he was anointed to be king. And this is what it says in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 12. Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel. Then they hasted and took every man his garment and put it under him on the top of the stairs and blew with trumpets, saying, Jehu is king. So I think that is somewhat relevant, because we obviously have an echo into the story we read today, as all the garments and various other things were actually placed in front of the king as he rode into the city. And the reason they did it was, of course, to show subservience, to show respect, to show that he was far above them. He could walk over their clothes as a mark of respect. And as I say, he was probably on foot at the time. It would make sense that he was. Another that came to mind is Haman. So Haman, thinking to honor himself, when King Xerxes said, what would the king do to honor such a man? And the first thing he thought of was, yes, he'll get up on the king's horse and he'll be paraded around in royal apparel, thinking, of course, it was for himself. And much to his horror, it wasn't. It was for Mordecai, who in the book of Esther really represents the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So Mordecai didn't choose that for himself, but that is the honor that he felt fit for a man who was honored before the king. And there are various other passages. You can, every time, maybe now that you're reading about a donkey or an ass, you might start to hear echoes or thoughts about some of the things we read when Christ rode into the city on the donkey. There is one that is a little more relevant directly to the story, and that is something in the law. So if you go right back to the time of the Exodus, there was, of course, their redemption at the time of the Passover from the slaying of the firstborns. Every firstborn man and animal in Egypt that wasn't under God's protection was lost. And so as a reminder of that, God asked that during the period of the festival, the time in which it was appointed, every clean and unclean animal had to be presented. Every firstborn, clean and unclean animal, and their own sons, had to be presented for sacrifice. And there are a few laws surrounding that. Now, the unclean animals, you had no choice with. Those were simply sacrificed. Those were required. But among the unclean animals, there was a different law. The unclean animals, you were given the choice. The choice was you sacrifice that unclean animal, or you buy it back at a price over and above its normal value. And it's specifically 1/5 above its normal value. Now, logically speaking, you would think that would be a bad financial decision to buy that animal back. But it was obviously a spiritual question put forward to the people at the time. Would you buy that animal or would you not? You have to remember that what God is trying to tell them here is that God did an enormous thing for you. An absolutely unbelievable thing for you to bring you out of Egypt. A massive, massive price was paid so that you would be redeemed. That price was way above what you yourselves are worth. If you think of the terrible things that occurred in Egypt that night. And yet I paid that price and you were redeemed. So here comes the animal. And you have to realize that perhaps you are this animal and perhaps you should be redeemed. And perhaps you should pay that extra money. And you are saved by grace. That is the principle of how we are saved. And so that's why it's the 5th. But that's the animal, unclean animal in general. But there was now, of course, the extra special provision for, of all animals, the ass. Exodus chapter 13 and verse 12. Thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all that opens the matrix, and every firstling that comes out of a beast which thou hast. The males shall be the Lord's. Verse 13, and every firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb. And if thou wilt not redeem it, then thou shalt break his neck, and all the firstborn of man among thy children shalt thou redeem. A lot of interesting details there. So the redemption of the donkey is put into the same verse where it's talking about the redemption of your own children. But there's a special clause for it. Special clause. Obviously, the children, you have no choice. You're going to redeem your children. What about this donkey? Was it worthwhile redeeming for the lamb? Again, back to the typical farming scenario, which would be more valuable in the general sense? You would have to assume that, generally speaking, an ass is worth more than a lamb. Your ass is your workhorse. You've probably got a much larger herd of animals in terms of the lamb. But in which case would you not sacrifice the lamb? And it would be in the case where this donkey was so stubborn and so awful that it wasn't even worth having. It was kicking down your fences, was just causing trouble. And so you'd rather just not even bother, and you could go and take the donkey and slaughter it. But again, just as it was with the 5th, the spiritually minded Israelite should really think very carefully about this and accept that that lamb was to be sacrificed for the redemption of that donkey. But if it didn't, how would it die? It died a bloodless death. It died with a very unusual punishment of having its neck broken. And that means it's not going to go through the usual path of sacrifice that a normal animal would be. That means there's no blood going to be spilled. So if no blood is going to be spilled, then that donkey is a goner. And I think you can understand what the lesson is, what the pointing forward to of that parable is. Because here, when we come to the New Testament, we have two donkeys. And the one was taken in and ridden by Christ, and the other one wasn't. And what did the people say who were in there? Their blood be upon us. Take Jesus and kill him. So they wanted him to die, but they didn't want him to die in the sense that animal was to be sacrificed. They refused the blood of Christ. They refused his sacrifice. And so the animal, which represents the Jews, was not worthy. So I think that's a lovely little parable all the way back from the law into the New Testament. And then the final reference, or there's actually two more. The reference maybe you would immediately have in mind when I said I was going to look at some of these would be that in Zechariah. So Zechariah is broken up into two sections. The first half of that chapter is talking about Alexander the Great, who conquered the Middle East, one of the rare military commanders who never lost a battle. And he rode through those areas and he just absolutely devastated the area all the way to the other end of India. And he rode on a black colt. He's very famous for having ridden around on his wonderful black stallion, which only he could tame and only he could ride. So thousands were slaughtered along the way. And in effect, he made himself king. He had carved out for himself one of the largest empires in history and is, even to this day, a very well known and well admired general. But in contrast, then we have in verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king comes unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, upon the colt, the foal of an ass. So there we have the complete contrast. And again, the contrast is through the rest of the chapter. Verse 10, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace unto the heathen. So that's what's happening on that day. It's at last peace to the heathen, as they are given their chance. And his dominion shall be from sea even to sea, and from the river even to the ends of the earth. So it's an end of bloodshed, end of suffering, peace to the Gentiles, and a whole new way of living set forth in this man. Calling of the nations to make them one, Jews and the Gentiles bound together. And then finally, one last one that came to mind, which is going to, I think, be the earliest reference we have in Scripture pointing to what we read this morning. Now, you might argue that maybe Abraham and Isaac's was earlier, but this one is just such a direct statement, such a direct prophecy, that I would maybe choose this as our first direct prophecy of what was to come. So in Genesis 49, this is speaking of Judah, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colts unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. So all the way back in Genesis, we have this prophecy. It's quite incredible how far back this was planned. How much work that the angelic host put into the organization of this huge long period of history and the things that would happen on that day. And God's forethought in planning all these things ahead. The scepter there being the symbol of authority in that verse. Shiloh, you might recognize as a very similar word to Shechem, Shiloh. Those kind of words often have similar meanings, speaking of peace and blessedness. And of course, that will happen once Jesus is established as king, and there will never be another king from that point onward. But in order to bring that about, first, he has to get onto that foal, onto that colt, and endure terrible suffering of what would it be ahead of him in those few days. So maybe with a few of those thoughts in our head, let's come back to Luke chapter 19 and just read through these last few verses that we had regarding this colt. So Luke 19 verse 30. So Jesus said to them, "Go into the village over against you. In the which at your entering you shall find a colt tied, whereon yet never man sat. Loose him and bring him hither. And if any man ask you, why do you loose him? Thus say ye unto him, because the Lord hath need of him." So that animal's prepared. And it's an animal which no one has ever sat on. This is the Gentiles for the first time going to be given the opportunity. The well-ridden animal has proven to be stubborn and worthless, but the unbroken colt is now called into service. Now, it's easy enough for us in the other verses to think, oh, the Jews didn't do this or that. Now it's our turn as the unbroken colt. Do we behave any differently? How are we as the Gentiles doing in contrast? Verse 32. And they that were sent went their way and found even as he had said unto them. And as they were loosing the colt, the owners thereof said unto them, "Why loose ye the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of him." Now notice that it was 2 Jews that were sent to found this colt. Just as in the time of the Acts, of course, it's the Jews that are sent out to proclaim and to call the Gentiles. But Mark has a little interesting addition to that little episode there. And he says the animals were tied by a door without the street, as opposed to being penned away and secured as you would normally have the animals. They were out on the street, which is quite an unusual thing. The worthwhile animal would be put away, but because it's out on the street, you might expect that it would be somewhat useless and you don't really care for it. Sometimes you drive up to the Berg and you find animals all over the place and you wonder, do people not actually care for their animals? The same kind of idea here. So it was perhaps useless to others, but the Lord had need of them, and he saw great use in those animals. So he took that animal and he mounted that animal and he rode in on the way. There's branches and there's clothes and all sorts of items got strewn before him, including palm branches, incidentally, which again is an interesting little detail to add, being the Gentiles. But what about this idea of being bound up to the vine? Because you read through the gospel records and you don't particularly see anything which says that he took that donkey and physically tied it to a vine. And I don't think we need it to literally be the case. We know what the parable represents. But nevertheless, I think it actually literally did happen. From the bit of historical reading and reading even in the Brotherhood that I've done, it seems extremely unlikely that it could be any other way. Because the side of the the area that Jesus entered, there just happened to be a magnificent vine built into one of the pillars on the wall of the gate. And it was known for miles around, and people would come and see this wonderful vine, these golden vines up the side of the pillars. And it was a very well-known thing. And it would just be at almost exactly that point that Christ would have had to have dismounted from that donkey in any case. And you can hardly imagine that having got off at that point, right next to that vine, that he wouldn't tie to that vine, literally speaking. But that we may never know. It seems impossible that it wouldn't be the case, though. But in that symbol, what do we know? We know that we are there in that cult, bound to that vine. You might remember that just after this incident, Jesus was challenged. By what authority do you cleanse this temple? What gives you the right to do all this? And Christ's answer was that he was the owner of that vineyard. And there we are, attached to him, tied up directly to that vine. And shortly after that, he was tied to the stake. And so we see all these wonderful comparisons and thoughts coming through in Scripture to really encourage us and to remind us that these things have been planned from so long ago. So what do we make of it? What is the real takeaway lesson of this? When we think of the donkey, when we think of the ass. The ass, of course, is a lowly animal. The king we serve is not one of pomp and ceremony. He's not one to put himself above everybody else in that sense. It is an exceptional thing that he rode that donkey and didn't choose some other animal. It speaks volumes for the king. It's a very humbling service, too, for that animal. It's wonderful to have the king ride upon you like that and be that animal. I mean, that is a great privilege. But remember that a donkey itself is a lowly animal. And sometimes we spend our lives trying to become the horse instead of the donkey. We need to remember that we are in a lowly service, in a sense. We are to be humble. We are to act in the spirit of an obedient animal and not be stubborn and wanting to protest the service into which we're called. So it's an introspection into our own lives as we consider what this animal represented. But it's a great honor, as I said, to be on that unbroken colt, and the Lord needing our service. So I hope some of these thoughts have been somewhat useful today as we come and consider our service in the week past and the week ahead, and how we are appropriate or not in our calling as the one in whom Christ has chosen to dwell and to make service a privilege for us.